Hello, and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers, and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. Back in those first few scary months of starting this podcast in 2018, I was fortunate to speak with my next guest about her brilliant debut novel, The Single Ladies of Jacaranda Retirement Village. Since I've had the pleasure of meeting Joanna Nell in person and revelling in the joy of reading her second novel, The Last Voyage of Mrs. Henry Parker, which was released last year. Now I get to do it all over again with her third brilliant and utterly charming novel, The Great Escape from Woodlands Nursing Home, which is just about to hit shelves across Australia. Much like hilarious Peggy Smart from The Single Ladies of Jacaranda Retirement Village, retired nature writer and reclusive spinster Hattie Bloom is not interested in growing old gracefully in a retirement home. She has more important things to be doing. And when she meets fellow inmate Walter Clements, who is equally desperate to get back home and to his normal life, despite an uneasy start, they join forces to hatch an escape plan. What follows is a hilarious but poignant and ultimately hopeful exploration of aging and life in aged care. I'm so happy to welcome Joanna back to the podcast today. Hi, Jo.
Hello, thank you. It's wonderful to be back. Thank you so much, Claudine.
It's my pleasure. Congratulations on another wonderful novel in The Great Escape from Woodlands Nursing Home. It was such a delightful, uplifting read.
Oh, thank you. That was certainly the aim. So it can be a subject that's not lends itself to being uplifting, but that was my aim. So thank you for that.
Once again, you've spotlighted ageing and challenged our perceptions and the common myths surrounding old age and the way we treat older people. So I wanted to know, were Hattie and Walter inspired by anyone in real life?
Oh, good question. Hattie was inspired by a woman I'd never met, actually. She was inspired by a woman I imagine lived, there's a little stone cottage near where I live, and I walked past or driven past that cottage for 17 years, and it's always looked very neglected and overgrown. I think my children used to think it was haunted, actually. And I was never quite sure if anyone lived there. Occasionally somebody would sort of cut down the foliage at the front. And in my sort of writer's imagination, I imagined a woman, a rather reclusive woman, a shy woman who lived there but didn't particularly like people. That there were lots of beautiful Angophora trees in the garden and surrounding area. And I thought perhaps she was someone who preferred birds to people. And so I imagined her character, but actually, physically, she was inspired. I've sort of found a little bit of a pattern here with the characters I do create, that they're so often actually inspired by a sort of a work of art. And in the previous book, it was a beautiful painting of Eileen Kramer that was an Archibald finalist. And in this one, physically, Hattie was inspired by an Archibald finalist again last year. It's got quite a long name. I think it's called Sarah Pearce's Miss Docker in Patrick White's A Cheery Soul by an artist called Jude Ray. And she's certainly not a cheery looking soul in the painting. She's rather old fashioned dressed and glasses sort of perched on the end of her nose and sort of looking rather sort of quizzically at the world. So when I saw this painting, I knew that was physically my Hattie. But knowing, that her character was somebody who hid herself away, and once I had Angophora Cottage, I could envisage her. Walter is probably a bit of I haven't really written from had a male main point of view character before, so he was rather an exciting challenge, and he's a bit of a montage of all the men in their sort of 80s and 90s I've ever met. Perhaps physically, I had my grandfather in mind, sort of rather slightly overweight, kindly, a gentleman. But, essentially, I think his dad joke propensity comes from my husband. In fact, my husband was reading an advanced copy of the book recently, and we were sort of sat side by side in bed reading our books. And he turned to me, sort of closed the book and said, is Walter me? And certainly, look, he has aspects of lots of different men that I met, and my husband is a sort of classic dad joke comedian, and he's very funny actually. But so I suppose, yes, he was a little bit based on my husband, perhaps sort of also fast forward 40 years.
Oh, that's wonderful. It sounds like something my husband would say to me. Is this based on me?
I think he's also the thing about Walter is that he's a man sort of trapped in a generation, really, and you know, he sort of gets that the world has changed a bit and that certain things are a little bit un-PC and it's not okay to say them, but he sort of says them anyway because he thinks them, and certainly there's sort of aspects of my father in that, and many conversations we've had where I've certainly bitten my tongue and we've agreed to sort of disagree on the role of women and how the world has changed, but in a good-natured way.
So then what was the kernel of inspiration for you to tell Hattie and Walter's story?
Look, I always start with a character, and I think in this particular book, Woodlands Nursing Home itself is the character, and so I suppose I would be wanting to sort of follow my natural progression of writing about aspects of old age and sort of take it one step further perhaps to into aged care. And you know, that transition to aged care is not easy for anyone, but I wanted to sort of put two people in that situation who are very different. And in fact, one of the themes of the book is loneliness, I think, and taking two quite lonely people, but lonely for very different reasons, and throwing them into an environment where they're surrounded by people, and ironically still experiencing loneliness. And I wanted them to be very different people, because this is really essentially what happens in somewhere like an aged care facility, is that people come together and live together who really in real life would have nothing in common. They come from all different walks of life. They're very different personalities. And so in Hattie's case, she's an introvert. She prefers her own company. And ironically, although she's lived alone all her life, she's never been lonely. But when she finds herself in an aged care facility and surrounded by people, particularly someone like Walter who's living next door, she finds that she's, you know, very uncomfortable and really wants to get out of that, and actually paradoxically experiences great loneliness there. And conversely, Walter, who's someone who is a widower and was lonely, although, you know, content to have what he saw as his independence at home, finds himself equally lonely in that environment, but more because what he craves is really deep human connection and human touch. Actually, you know, he's got, I suppose, what we call, you know, skin hunger. He longs to have that touch, and not just from the podiatrist sort of filing down his toenails. So they're two very different people with really almost extremes of personality who end up living next door to each other. And I suppose one of the questions was, what happens when you put these two people together? Can they form a friendship? Can they form a relationship and actually, you know, when faced with a problem, sort of come together, put aside their differences and find that, you know, they have more in common than makes them different.
So tell me about your decision to make Hattie an ornithologist.
Essentially, a lot of Hattie is perhaps me in another life. I, you know, identify as an introvert, although I'm very happy. I have lots of friends and a beautiful family, and I don't do too well on my own for very long, but I wanted to explore that a little bit more. But something else is very intrinsic to me is my love of nature and sort of conservation, and particularly birds. That's something that has been a lifelong love of mine and passion of mine. When I was little, my grandfather used to take me into the woods behind where he lived, and we'd go and search for birds' nests, and we'd talk about the different birds that came to the bird table. And that's something that I've also found with my own father. British birds, we're talking about little sort of British garden birds, are quite different to the beautiful Australian native bird life that we have here. But to my father and I, it's almost our language of communication. Mum and I think, as a lot of mothers and daughters do, you know, have a natural conversation and talk about all sorts of things. But with my father and I, once we move past the weather, the way we communicate is by talking about birds. It's a beautiful thing. He's really taught me to identify birds and their habits and appreciate them. And we send each other pictures and videos, and there's a beautiful book I remember growing up that he had, which I think he'd inherited from someone as well, with beautiful, hand-painted plates of all the different native birds. And I studied this for hours and hours as a child. So I've always been fascinated by that. And perhaps a bit like Hattie, that idea of, who hasn't as a child dreamed of flying or actually had a dream about flying and been fascinated with that. So I suppose this was the perfect opportunity. It seemed the perfect background for her. I think she's a self-taught, or, she has had no formal training as a science writer or journalist. She's just a keen amateur, as I suppose a lot of us start out as. But she started writing a column in the local paper, which sort of progressed into, a series of books and essays on bird behaviour. And to Hattie, bird behaviour makes perfect sense. Human behaviour, not quite so much. So that's really what she learns. She's almost observing a new species, really, when she moves into aged care. So her love of birds, that really comes from me and my passion.
And the thing that I really loved was, I think a while ago you posted something on your social media about different birds and their personality traits. It wasn't something I had turned my mind to before, but, in reading Hattie's commentary and her observations, it really does ring true. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so she's comparing birds to the groups of people, or the different kinds of people that she meets, and she's trying to make sense of the human race through what she knows best, which are bird behaviour. So a lot of the carers, they stick together and chatter in small groups, and she sort of likens them to the minor birds. She, I think, sees herself perhaps as the wise old owl who, she's having trouble sleeping, so she's awake at night, and I suppose she has that little bit of wisdom. In fact, in researching this, I found out, because there's sort of a bit of a symbol or a motif, I suppose, through the book is that of the owl, and I found recently that owls are like a totem in Indigenous cultures, actually, representing women. So that seemed a lovely parallel. Yes, she noticed that some birds are shy and reclusive and take a little while to warm up to humans, and some just sort of come in and squabble and fight over food. And certainly, based on observations of all the birds that come, and we have lots of birds that come and visit our balcony, and there's certainly a pecking order as well there, and it's certainly not the largest birds that are top of the pecking order. Sometimes it's like the little rainbow lorikeets that come in, and they're confident little birds. It was interesting to use that sort of parallel and the analogy of the bird to human behaviour.
Yes, and I love the fact that she likened Walter to a kookaburra.
Yes, sort of laughing at his own jokes, exactly.
I just love that. Definitely one of those laugh out loud moments for me in the book. It was entirely apt, I think. So I was intrigued by the character of Sister Bronwyn and her unconventional approach to her night shift duties. And I know from my own ageing relatives that sleep often eludes older people at night. So I wondered if aged care facilities did use different strategies to combat this issue, or if Sister Bronwyn is a trailblazer in this regard.
That's a very good question. I think that whole aspect of the night and day, the difference between night and day in an aged care facility is really the basis of the premise of the book. What I'd been aware of in my working as a GP and visiting aged care facilities was how often I was asked to write up, and I often resisted this, was to write up night medication, so night sedation for people, so that they could sleep, or rather, perhaps would sleep through the night. And what we know is that as people age, their sleeping habits change, and it's very unusual for an older person to sleep for a solid 8 hours at night. And really all we do with sleeping tablets, with medication, is to put people really into a sort of semi-coma for a time. It's certainly not natural sleep. They also have terrible side effects. They make people drowsy during the day. They increase the risk of falls and confusion. So I think that's one of the things that the recent Royal Commission highlighted was the overuse of chemical restraints, and particularly sort of night sedations. But it is a problem. It's sort of an open secret really in aged care that at night, at the time when there's the lowest number of staff on and sometimes not a qualified nurse on duty, is the time when most people are sort of wandering around. Those who are living with dementia are perhaps wandering around in a state of confusion. There are others for whom just simply their sleep pattern means that they wake up or they're not asleep. And I, use the analogy of night owls and larks. There are some that don't go to sleep until, perhaps after midnight, and those who go to sleep early but wake up very early, while it's still dark. And those are sort of lifelong patterns or habits of sleep that are not likely to change. If anything, are likely to become more obvious when somebody moves into an artificial environment. And it was reading a book called Providing Good Care at Night for Older People, which is actually like a manual for nursing and care homes. And I was reading it for my own sort of personal, professional development. And I had a bit of a light bulb moment. This was really creating or suggesting strategies to help nursing staff really entertain people at night, because I think this comes to the essence of where we're going wrong with aged care, in that we're trying to fit people into a model of care rather than create a model of care around what people's individual needs are. And this was really highlighted with the night care. So Sister Bronwyn, in many ways, she sort of epitomises, I think, what's good about an aged care worker. She's really passionate about her job. She genuinely has affection and cares for all her residents as individuals. But what I like is that she's not afraid to sort of break a few rules. She doesn't really strictly always follow protocols, including bringing her old dog Queenie in to work, which ultimately causes a few problems. And for me, although the idea of her social club, the Night Owls, where she sort of welcomes people who can't sleep and, serves them her own version of cocktails and canopies and gives them interesting activities to do and encourages them to mingle. Although that's a rather sort of, I suppose, fanciful and romantic idea of, how to deal with this issue, I think it was really just an idea to say this is perhaps how we could look at making this care better. But of course, it doesn't always fit in with a rigid model of how care works, and it isn't supported by the staffing numbers. So yes, I suppose the book really hangs on Sister Bronwyn's night owls and really what happens when her little sort of clandestine nighttime operation comes crashing down and she's dismissed. And really this gives the impetus for Hattie and Walter, who obviously love her as much as the other residents, to sort of work together to sort of get her reinstated.
It was really a wonderful insight into the way aged care centres could operate, I guess.
Look, I certainly don't imagine that the model of the Night Owls is, with everything that did go on at the Night Owls, probably not going to be adopted widely. But it was really just perhaps an invitation to say, look, I think we perhaps need to think a bit more creatively, and certainly rather than, drug people into a convenient 8 hours of sleep at night to cater to their needs. Yeah, with a little bit more ingenuity.
Now, Jo, you mentioned the Royal Commission, and that was something that I wanted to ask you a little bit about. I mean, obviously in recent years, the aged care sector has taken a bit of a beating, with the Royal Commission being established back in 2018 and the impact of COVID and the resulting devastation amongst residents of aged care, especially in Victoria. Now, not to take anything away from this wonderful story and your perceptive insight into life inside an aged care facility, but were these things you had in the back of your mind when you were writing this book?
I mean, I started writing the book before I think the Royal Commission was even announced. And so these were issues that I had long been aware of. This crisis really, and it is a crisis, if you like, in aged care, has been a long time coming. It's been decades, if not centuries in coming. The model we had, 200, 150 years ago, of even 100 years ago, of older people being looked after in a nuclear family or in the extended family, and passing away peacefully in their old age, through charity-run, silent and benevolent organisations, through to the middle of last century, where a lot of elderly people were cared for in hospitals, in geriatric wards or psychogeriatric units, none of which sound particularly appealing, but certainly there were centres of expertise in care. And what we've seen is that model has changed completely, and that now people are living longer, which is a fantastic thing. That's a tribute to modern medicine, of course. But what we're finding is that we're living, and particularly women, living longer with disability. And what everybody wants to do is to live independently in their own homes for as long as possible. But what we're then seeing is that people, when they moved into aged care facilities, it's usually when, as I say, the last wheel has fallen off the wagon and there's some sort of, immediate crisis. In Hattie's case, like a fall. It's not something that people want to talk about and really think about and plan in advance. So people are often quite frail. They're living longer in aged care with really complex medical needs, and often, quite a advanced dementia. And this model is run in the community. It's not a medical model. And it's run largely by not government-run units, but by non-government or for-the-profit sector. There are quite a few that are run by church-run or non-profit organisations. So we're looking at an industry where, and it is an industry, it's a for-profit industry, where the people who work in that are often very poorly paid. So a nurse working in an aged care facility would earn significantly less than one working in like an acute care ward in a hospital, maybe $10 to $20 an hour less. The general care staff would have very basic training. This is part of the reason I wanted to write this book, was to highlight the many wonderful staff. Yes, of course there are bad apples, and we've seen the terrible consequences of that. But I think in many ways these people are not sociopaths who go into aged care. Some of these have come from the extreme burnout of staff that we see. You can only squeeze so much out of a workforce becoming ill through stress, which puts then more pressure on those that remain behind to work. And so these were the things that I was seeing firsthand and aware of. And although I loved my time working in aged care, I loved the interaction with the residents. I spent many hours sitting and listening and talking to the residents, my patients. I also spent a lot of time listening and sort of counselling the staff who really were sometimes on their knees. And these were people who did care, but they weren't supported necessarily by a hierarchy and a structure of a system that was there to help them to do their job of caring. They were simply stretched too thinly. And I suppose I was unable to change that from within the system, to my great regret. I tried sort of one day at a time, one incident at a time to change it, and had no success. And like many people working in that industry, very passionate about the job, but ultimately felt deflated and burned out. So I suppose in writing the book, I'm perhaps taking a step back and trying to highlight it and make changes by getting the word out there and getting people talking about these, perhaps.
Tell me about Queenie and your inspiration for putting Queenie in this book.
Queenie is unashamedly based on my dog. I think if anyone follows me on social media, particularly Instagram, you will know Margot, particularly if you saw my recent post of her being attacked by a brush turkey.
Oh, that's right.
Margot is my elderly black Labrador who really is the sort of glue in our family, and she's my muse. I do joke that she's my muse. We sort of walk every day, and she's such a huge part of my life. I think there tends to be a dog, or there probably will be a dog in most of the work that I do, but I think that she's someone that everybody, all the residents and staff, universally relate to. but she does violate health and safety. And the paradoxes and ironies of health and safety are, a theme that runs through the book. Queenie sort of violates virtually every health and safety regulation that's in place at Woodlands, hence that Sister Bronwyn has to bring her in undercover at night. And we know that pets and, dogs and cats and birds even create a sense of well-being. They, release endorphins. They've been shown to lower blood pressure, even just stroking a cat or a dog. And some of the facilities that I've worked in have even had a little clutch of ducklings, I remember, in one. They, I think you can see these in school classrooms as well, where the eggs arrive under the lamp, and then over the next week or two, the chicks hatch and they're passed around the class and as a bit of a class pet. And one facility that I worked in had ducklings that hatched, and they were passed around, and it created such a wonderful sense of community. And you could see that people who were previously withdrawn or perhaps showing signs of depression, something really fundamental changed in them. Their faces changed, and they had this relationship with this creature. And so I think the idea was partly to give my dog a role in the book, but partly she was a plot device to get the night owls uncovered, and we won't sort of spoil any or give any spoilers there. She was a little bit of a plot device, but she was also perhaps another suggestion that homes could include more sort of pets as therapy or on staff. So I think, Queenie's officially on staff. Yeah.
Yes, indeed she is. Now, I recently read a beautiful article that you wrote for Louise Allen's blog, the Writers in the Attic series, if anyone's interested in looking it up. And in it, you talk about having a personal epiphany and understanding that you identify as an introvert, as you mentioned earlier. It's something that you have in common with Hattie, and that you finally found your tribe. So not many people understand that you can engage in things like public speaking, appear in front of audiences and record podcasts like you're doing today, but still be an introvert, and that it just takes more conscious effort to do so, doesn't it?
It certainly does, yes. Again, Louise Anne, another great supporter, like yourself, of Australian writers. But look, I think a lot of writers, and perhaps I think 40% of the population would be fulfill the criteria for introversion. But growing up, I was always the quiet, the shy. I was painfully shy, because it's a painful condition, or maybe it's painful to everyone else to be shy. And I certainly grew up thinking that I was inadequate in some way. I didn't have this confidence to be outgoing, and even one teacher who said to me, "You'd be much better if you could be outgoing like your friend here." And I think we're perhaps a little bit more subtle about these things now with our children, raising them, but how this label could sort of follow me. And it was reading a book a few years ago called Quiet by Susan Cain. I think it's called The Power of an Introvert in the World That Won't Stop Talking. And it was really a revelation. That was my epiphany, was that I just had a certain personality, and some of that might be genetic. I have two introverted parents. There was really nothing wrong with that, and that we have a lot of skills and ability to perhaps think, if not talk, off the cuff. So certainly the thoughts are all there in our head. I think we tend to be people who think deeply about things. If you've ever thought of the perfect comeback to a comment, or about an hour after it's happened, or even 5 minutes after it's happened, or you've put it into your writing somewhere, you're an introvert. You can think those thoughts, but there's a process that your brain needs to go through, and it doesn't always come straight out of your mouth, which can leave you, what can certainly leave me, very tongue-tied at times. So the thought of standing up in public, talking about myself, I think also being a doctor as well, perhaps a career I chose because it made me focused on listening to other people rather than talking myself. But that was one of the biggest fears I had when I heard that I was about to be published with the first book. Of course, it was an absolute dream come true beyond that, really. But when the news sunk in, there was an awful realization that suddenly I was going to have to get up on stage and do interviews and things. And this filled me with absolute terror. And I really had to do quite a lot of work around that, including working with a psychologist, actually, around really what I had as a fear of public speaking. And I think that the essence of that came down to authenticity. and just being yourself. And it sounds a bit trite, just be yourself, but I think trying not to be anything else. Who you are on stage is who you are off stage, and there are many different styles of talking in public and presenting. I'd say to anybody who is sort of perhaps thinking that this might hold them back, or something. I mean, perhaps if somebody's got a book coming out and they're worried about this, to identify it and to do what you need to work around it. But that it does get easier. But lots of what makes us introverts is actually also what makes us writers too. Ability to sit on your own for long periods of time in your own head. That's a discipline that other people don't necessarily have.
So the Single Ladies of Jacaranda Retirement Village has sold over 50,000 copies now, which is just phenomenal. Wonderful tribute to your fabulous writing. I'm not surprised by its success in any way. But what I wanted to ask you is, do you think that this says something about the kinds of stories that people want to read, that we're no longer interested in ignoring ageing or pretending that we aren't all headed in that direction one day?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure it is. And, I'm sure it's not because of that book, well embraced as it's been, and, much fun I had writing that. And certainly people have enjoyed reading it, obviously. But and when I wrote that, I think we were, even a few years ago, still in a place where we weren't really telling stories about old age. It's something we really tried not to think about. We were still better sort of thinking out of sight, out of mind. But I think we are seeing a generation, or our generation, baby boomer generation, sort of growing up and facing this ourselves, and being perhaps a little bit more vocal, are starting to talk about it. And I think with that book, I just happened to, at the time I came to pitch that book, perhaps hit the beginning of a change, a zeitgeist. And there have been quite a lot of well-known and outspoken advocates for age now. I think, Jane Caro and This Chair Rocks is a great website and social media following. Ashton Applewhite, I think her name is. I listened to her recently in Talking Live. And I think that particularly women have really had enough of being, told to age in a certain way, and I think it's, every woman at a certain age will be aware of that feeling of invisibility. And sometimes that's quite nice. I can sort of pop down to the bottle shop in my Ugg boots and nobody even sees me. But also, it's one thing not to be seen. It's another thing not to be heard, or to be noticed, or to have that, your life matters. And particularly women, I think, once they get past the childbearing years, menopause for a lot of women is, the beginning of a whole new and exciting time of their life, when perhaps their families are growing up and like mine, becoming more self-sufficient or leaving home. And they're faced with really another, could be 40, 50 years of their life where they're free to do whatever they like. And I don't think, a lot of women are prepared to go quietly. A lot of women have, unfulfilled desires and dreams, or former careers that they want to start. A lot of women are very innovative and good at multitasking. And so I think it's just perhaps part of that, and perhaps ageism is still there. Look, I certainly think we're a very ageist society, but I feel very confident that, of all the discriminations, that this is perhaps the last one to, for us to start talking about, and to really change the way we talk about.
Jo, given your experiences in the publishing sphere over the last few years, I wanted to know, are there things that you know now that you wish someone had told you back then, or that you'd known before your first book was published?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, where do we start? It's you don't know what you don't know until you get there, and there's perhaps lots of questions I should have asked beforehand. Way back, I wish somebody would have told me that the first manuscript that I slaved over for 4 years and agonized over, sending out to publishers and agents and pitching, that actually was just my training novel, that wasn't going to get published, and that wasn't a bad thing. I wish that somebody had said, your next novel, your second novel after that, is not going to be any easier. In fact, it's going to feel harder, but it's okay because you can do it. So each book I have to sort of remind myself, just because I've done it before, it's going to feel, more in theory, but it's still going to be a challenging process. I wish somebody had told me that even with a best-selling novel, I couldn't sort of retire and buy a private island or a Learjet. But it's still really good to keep the day job, both to keep yourself level-headed, to give your creative brain a little bit of a rest, and also to help pay the bills. There's only a very small handful, I think, of authors that make a really good living from their writing alone. So yes, I have lots of wisdom that I'd like to share with that slightly younger self, for sure.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that. So, Jo, what's next? Are you working on something else at the moment?
I am, yes. I signed another 2-book deal, the first book of which is The Great Escape, and that's the book for this year. And I have a book that I'm due to deliver and submit very soon, which is in a little bit of a challenge with all that 2020 has thrown up. But that manuscript will, depending on how publishing schedules go, be the book for 2021. And look, different cast of characters, and in this case, set in a hospital, was inspired by a trip I took last Christmas to the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford, where I trained, and I hadn't set foot in that hospital since 1991, but my son on New Year's Eve showed me his elbow, which was very swollen and infected, and we were desperately trying to find a doctor, and a lot of that hospital hadn't changed at all since 1991, but including the volunteer-run kiosk, the tea room that I'm sure the cakes that were being served there were probably the same ones from 30 years ago. But the group of volunteers that were working in the kiosk were doing it with the same enthusiasm and gusto that I always remembered them, and so that was really the inspiration for the next book, which doesn't have a title yet. The code name The Kiosk, I think, the working title. Yeah.
As you may know, there are many writers now who listen to this podcast. So I wondered if you might offer a few tips for those who are trying to write a novel or looking to get one published.
I was listening to the episode you did with Jane Harper, which was fantastic. And I totally agree with Jane that there are no rules. You shouldn't say to yourself, this is how I must do it because this is how I've been told to do it. I think you listen to what other people do and you find what works for you. So I'm just going to say what I sometimes find useful. I find that momentum is the one thing, particularly when I'm writing a first draft. Having written several manuscripts now and edited them up to, obviously the standard that they need to be for publication, I really struggle now with writing a first draft. It makes me very cranky for quite a few weeks, as it just is a mess, and the characters change names and I have ideas halfway through, and there's whole scenes that I know won't make it through, and new ones that I need to write. But if I stopped and went back and edited and rewrote those scenes, whatever, I would never finish that first draft. So for me, I would say try and keep up the momentum, get through. The first draft is just a first draft. Just put all your ideas down. It's just you telling yourself the story, and you can go back and fix it on the second draft and the third draft. So I think just get through. So many people stall, I think, with their first book because they're going back and trying to fix things as they go along. If you are stuck, one thing I found it works really well for me is I sort of lose momentum, or I lose my way halfway through and I get a bit bored after a certain period of time. So if I get to that point, what I do is I go down to Officeworks and I print out the whole manuscript. I don't get it bound, and I get it printed double-sided so I can recycle again. That's sort of part of my sort of environmental thing. But reading it through for me in hard copy, first of all, have a read through without making any notes. Then read through it again, just make a few notes in the margin or, scribble on it. That really helps me to get my head back into the story and find that pace again that I need to get through to the end. And the final piece of advice is something I heard on a podcast recently, and I to my shame, I can't remember the name of the podcast. It was an American writing podcast. And the presenter said, the first and the last scene of the novel should essentially tell the whole story. So, you might be aware of that advice that they should mirror each other, the first and last. But I thought that was a good rule of thumb. So, between your first and your last scene, essentially that should tell the story. And going back to Jane Harper's advice about writing from, the last scene first or the ending first, that might be a good way to start, to know where it starts and to know where it ends.
Thank you so much for that. So if listeners wanted to connect with you, Jo, and learn more about you and your books, how could they do that?
I have a website, which is www.joannanell.com. And I'm all over sort of social media on various things, depending on the mood. And I can never remember my handles, but basically look up either Jo Nell Writer or Joanna Nell Writer. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. I have an author page and on Twitter.
Jo, it's been an honour to chat with you again and to celebrate the launch of The Great Escape from Woodlands Nursing Home. And may it fly off the shelves, my friend.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Claudine.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.